On the whole, the residents of Little Brackley were rather proud of the Royal George Hotel. It was not strictly speaking royal, nor especially Georgian. A square block of respectable red brick with ivy clambering up its front, it stood half a mile outside the village on the main road to Milchester, and provided, as Mrs. D. Bantry of Gossington Hall once remarked, a perfectly tolerable luncheon and utterly intolerable coffee. Still, it had pretensions. There were framed prints of fox hunting scenes, a faded palm in the lounge, and a discreet little notice behind the reception desk advertising, "Conference facilities available." It was to these facilities that the Reverend Leonard Clement, vicar of St. Mary Mead, had lately fallen victim. Clergymen, he observed his wife, seemed now expected to be up to date, and nothing could be more fatiguing than being up to date. Nevertheless, he had agreed to attend the Diocesan Pastoral Conference at the Royal George, and since the hotel boasted a ladies' sitting room and an unremarkable but serviceable lift, Miss Jane Marple had come too for a little change of air. "The rooms are very clean, dear," she had said to Mrs. Clement with her usual gentle seriousness, "and there is a most obliging chambermaid. She has recently become engaged to a plumber, which is quite an elevation from her point of view. Engagements," added Miss Marple thoughtfully, "often make people more observant of their surroundings." What precisely the engaged chambermaid observed on the third afternoon of the conference was destined to be discussed for many months in Little Brackley parlours at St. Mary, or mead teas, and, rather less comfortably, across the polished desk of Chief Inspector Craddock at Scotland Yard. The ordinary event of that afternoon was a tea. It was not in itself a promising occasion for drama. Limp cucumber sandwiches, pink iced fancies, a large and dusty rubber plant, and a selection of rural clergy in varying degrees of shabbiness. The bishop, a portly man with a benevolent manner, was expected to give a short address afterwards on the church and the modern conscience. This the hotel manager, Mr. Arms Pritchard, hovered, anxious that everything should be dignified, and that the bishop should not notice the crack in the plaster above the fireplace. In a corner of the lounge, half screened by a potted fern doing its best to die gracefully, Miss Marple sat very upright in a chintz-covered armchair, her knitting bag at her feet. She was not at that precise moment knitting, she was listening, which with Miss Marple was a far more serious occupation. He absolutely refused to leave his room. Mr. Pritchard was saying in a low and flustered voice to the assistant manager, a pale young man with spectacles. "And at such a time, the bishop here, really, it is most inconvenient." "Perhaps he is ill, sir," murmured the young man. "If he is ill, he can be ill somewhere else," snapped Mr. Pritchard. "Room 666 is reserved for the bishop this evening. I cannot offer his lordship the Garden View single. Besides," he added, with a kind of outraged prudery, "the gentleman is not, I think, the sort of person we should wish to encourage." Miss Marple's mild blue eyes rested for a moment on Mr. Pritchard's agitated face. A gentleman in room 6 refusing to leave. An objection to the sort of person. These were small things apparently, but Miss Marple had spent a long lifetime observing that it was the small things which mattered most. Presently the bishop arrived. There was a flutter, a scraping back of chairs, a general murmur. Tea resumed. Clergymen talked earnestly. Outside, an autumn wind stirred the brown leaves along the gravel drive. It was at precisely 10 minutes past 4 that the engaged chambermaid, carrying a clean towel and thinking, with pleasurable agitation, of her wedding dress, went up in the lift to the top floor and walked along the corridor to room 666. She tapped once, then twice. There was no reply. She tried the handle, hesitated, because one always hesitates even when one has the master key, and finally opened the door. Her scream, high and thin and terrible, cut across the hum of conversation downstairs like a knife. Miss Marple, who had been watching the bishop butter a scone with absent-minded care, set down her cup very gently. "Fancy," she said to no one in particular, "that something rather distressing has occurred." There was an instant frozen glance after the scream, as though the very beams of the golden pheasant held their breath. Then everything happened at once. Chairs scraped, teacups were rattled on the saucers, and the usual English reluctance to create a scene gave way to something older and more powerful, the irresistible pull of catastrophe. Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Jane, did you hear?" "Very distinctly," Miss Marple replied, rising a little more slowly than the others. "Someone is in considerable distress. I think we had better check up, don't you?" Colonel Melchett, whose notions of duty were as robust as his moustache, had already begun to thunder toward the staircase. "No one leave the building!" he shouted, though in fact no one seemed inclined to do anything so sensible. The bishop, pale but dignified, murmured something about remaining calm. Dr. Haydock pushed past Mrs. Bantry with a muttered, "Excuse me," his professional instincts fully awakened. Miss Marple, in no unseemly haste, followed the general exodus. On the landing above, the corridor stretched away, its worn runner muffling the scurrying footsteps. At the far end, near the door bearing the brass numerals 66, a little knot of people had already formed. The young chambermaid, white-faced and trembling, Mr. Whodunit, Ashworth, looking both flustered and defensive, and the frightened waiter, who kept glancing towards the stairs as if hoping for rescue. "It's Mr. Thorne, sir." The chambermaid was gasping as Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry approached. "I brought up the hot water, like always, and when I knocked and he didn't answer, I tried the door and it wasn't locked, and then—" Yes, Millie, we've gathered there's something amiss," said Dr. Haydock briskly. "Now stand aside, all of you." The door to room 66 stood half open, as if in invitation or warning. Inside, the heavily modernised comfort of the inn's best suite awaited. The large bed, the dark green curtains, the clever little electric fire. And on the carpet, a little to the left of the writing desk, lay Silas Thorne. Miss Marple did not go in at once. She stood in the doorway, noting, with the eye of long habit, the general impression. A glass overturned near the bedside table, a chair slightly askew, the window shut fast. Against the autumn and on the bed itself, an open suitcase, with its contents disturbingly neat. Haydock knelt beside the bedside. His heart they were hidden into the familiar mask of clinical detachment. "He's dead," he said after a moment. "Has been, I should say, for at least half an hour. Heart, perhaps. But—" He broke off, frowning slightly at the man's contorted features, the strange bluish tinge about the lips. Miss Ashworth cleared his throat nervously. "Accident, doctor. We must hope. I mean, for the sake of the inn's reputation, we must hope," said Dr. Year. Haydock dryly, "for the arrival of the police, and no one," he added, raising his voice, "is to touch anything in this room." Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the little glass on the floor. A faint crystalline residue clung to the inside. She did not go nearer, but her mind, as always, went back. Back to a retired colonel in a seaside boarding house, to a young woman in a milliner's shop, to a curate's landlady in much the same state, and to the particular shade of blue that came so inevitably with certain quiet, efficient poisons. Downstairs, the sound of voices was rising. News had already begun its swift, unstoppable journey through the inn. Mr. Thorne was dead. He had been struck down in the devil's room. He had been murdered. He had died of fright. He had seen something on the wall, no, in the mirror, no, at the window. Miss Marple heard snippets as they drifted up the stairwell. Told him not to tempt Providence. I did. Said he had enemies in London. Quarrelling with his wife all morning. The old lady's expression remained mild, but within she was asking herself a series of very quiet, very precise questions. People did not, in her experience, die dramatically in numbered bedrooms without sufficient reason, and when sufficient reasons existed, they were usually to be found not in the devil's number upon the door, but in the far more commonplace arithmetic of human greed, fear, anger and desperation. "Colonel Melchett," said Miss Marple gently, when the chief constable turned from the body with a grim set to his jaw. "I expect you will wish to send for Inspector Slack." Melchett grunted. "Slack's nearest. I'll have the station ring him at once. Confounded business! Devil's room indeed. Superstitious nonsense." "Superstition," observed Miss Marple, "is so often a convenient veil, don't you think? It draws the eye away from more practical matters." The colonel stared at her, half irritated, half reassured by her calm. "Well," he said shortly, "we shall soon see what the matters are at the bottom of this." He looked around at the assembled faces. "Until Inspector Slack arrives, let's have everyone downstairs, no one to leave the inn. Names, occupations, where they were this last hour, we'll have it all." Miss Marple followed the others down the stairs, her slight figure almost lost among the bulkier forms. On the landing, she paused very briefly and looked back along the corridor. 6 doors on either side, and at the end in room 66. "It is murmured to herself. How some people enjoy playing with danger, and how very often danger finds it tiresome to remain a game. Then she went down to the crowded tea room where the first confused theories of St. Mary Mead were already beginning to bloom, eager and inaccurate as ever. By the time Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham, the golden pheasant had become a hive of conjecture. The autumn light had faded to a grey dusk, and the low beams of the tap room seemed to hold the whispers like smoke. They do say as he asked for that room in particular, old Mr. Pierce, the village was informing an eager circle near the bar. Room 666. Mark my words. Tempting Providence never did nobody any good. Nonsense, Pierce, Mrs. Bantry retorted briskly. Mr. Thorne was poisoned, not visited by devils. There's a very real person behind this, you may depend upon it. Poison, Miss Hartnell, the spinster who prided herself on never missing a scandal, repeated with relish. Well, one can't say it's unexpected. I heard in the post office only last week that these finance men make very dangerous enemies. Miss Marple sat quietly near the hearth, her knitting needles moving with steady precision. She appeared to be paying more attention to her drop stitches than to the talk, but in reality, her unobtrusive ears were gathering fragments, testing them against the patterns of human behaviour she knew so well. Into this murmurous atmosphere strode Inspector Slack, square-shouldered, impatient, and with an air of being permanently a little offended by village life. He spoke first with Colonel Melchichet in a low voice, then requested that the principal witnesses be assembled in the private parlour. Miss Marple, of course, was not among those summoned, yet contrived, with the innocent efficiency of old ladies everywhere, to be passing along the corridor at precisely the moment the door of the parlour remained slightly ajar. Inside sat Mr. Bear, Ashworth, pale and perspiring, and Thomas, twisting his cap between nervous fingers. Betty, red-eyed but eager, Mrs. Dalrymple, the cook, solid and indignant, and Mrs. Clara Thorne, very straight and very still. Now then, Inspector Slack began, notebook in hand, we'll take this in order. You, young man, you took the deceased his tea at 4 o'clock? Yes, sir, Thomas stammered. From the kitchen to room 666, Mrs. Dalrymple poured it herself. I put the pot and cup on the tray, with the milk jug and sugar bowl. Then I set it on the sideboard in the passage while I went back in for the biscuits Mr. Thorne had ordered, 2 Bath Oliver and 1 ginger nut. So, for that time, Slack said, the tray was unattended. In the passage, sir. Anyone going up or down could have passed it, Thomas admitted miserably. Inspector Slack turned to Mrs. Dalrymple. You prepared the tea. You're sure nothing was amiss when you poured it? Mrs. Dalrymple drew herself up. I've been making tea in respectable homes for 30 years, Inspector. There was nothing amiss when that tray left my kitchen. I'll swear to it on the book. Miss Marple, hovering delicately beyond the doorway, caught the faintest flicker in Clara Thorne's expression at this declaration. Not fear, precisely, but a tightening, as saw, though some private calculation had been upset. And you, Mrs. Thorne, Slack said, when did you last see your husband alive? This morning, Inspector. Yeah. Inspector, she answered in a calm, low voice. After breakfast, he went out to make a telephone call in the village. We rarely disturbed one another in the afternoons. My husband valued his privacy. Did he have enemies? Slack's tone sharpened. She hesitated, the fraction of a second that Miss Marple always found so revealing. My husband had business rivals, certainly, but to speak of enemies would be melodramatic. Melodramatic, is it? Slack muttered, making a note. Man doesn't get himself poisoned in a country inn without help from somewhere. In the passage, Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully on the half-opened door, where a faint draught stirred the heavy curtain at the far end of the corridor, drawing her attention once more to that curious, inexplicable movement of air that seemed to come from nowhere at all. Inspector Slack, having delivered his little jab, turned away with an air of finality. Right, Sir Chitson, he said briskly to his sergeant. Bring that young waiter back in. Thomas Green. We'll have another go at him. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, but her thoughts were not on her scarf. In her experience, the police were often most fascinated by the person who had the least opportunity to commit the crime, while paying far less attention to those whose motives were more subtle. Colonel Melchett drifted toward her chair, his heavy features creased with worry. You don't really think it as simple as Slack suggests, do you, Miss Marple? My dear Colonel, she replied mildly, I have known many murderers who would have been most gratified by Inspector Slack's approach. Scapegoats are so very useful, particularly when they are young, frightened, and of no great consequence in the eyes of society. Melchett sighed. Slack's convinced the boy tampered with the tea while it was on the sideboard. Says Thorne insulted him publicly. Says it's just the sort of thing to drive a hot-headed youngster over the edge. Possibly, Miss Marple agreed. And yet, in my experience, true poisoners are rarely impulsive. It requires forethought, planning, and a certain coldness of temperament. One sees it in cases of unpleasant wills and disputed inheritances. Jealousy, too, can produce such careful malice. But that is more often found in homes than in hotel kitchens. Dr. Haydock, who had drawn near in time to catch this last observation, gave a dry chuckle. You mean, Jane, that if someone slipped Thorne's strychnine, it was more likely a family matter than a servant's grudge? Not necessarily family, Miss Marple corrected gently, but someone who stood to gain or to lose a very, very great deal. Financially, perhaps. Emotionally, almost certainly. Her eyes retreated toward Clara Thorne, still seated by the window, still dry-eyed. Miss Marple noticed, not for the first time, the slight shadow of an old bruise near the woman's left wrist, and the way she flinched imperceptibly each time a door banged. A little while later, when Inspector Slack had removed himself upstairs to glare at the crime scene once more, Miss Marple allowed her ball of wool to roll quite accidentally toward the passage leading to the service area. Retrieving it, she found herself by the linen closet, where Betty was folding sheets under the harsh glare of an electric bulb. Such a dreadful thing for you, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly, to be the one to find him. It must give one such a turn. I remember when old Mr. Harbottle in our lane fell down in his well. It was months before the maids would fetch me after dark. Betty swallowed. They were horrible, ma'am. His eyes. She broke off. Can you get the secret? Oh, shush, dear little. Miss Marple patted her arm, then began to help in her ineffective way with a pile of towels, a finger surprisingly nimble for an old lady. As she lifted a neatly folded sheet from the bottom shelf, something small and stiff slid fractionally beneath her fingers. A corner of white paper thrust hastily out of sight, among the linen. Dear me, Miss Marple said, with carefully contrived vagueness. How very careless of me. I'm always dropping things in the most inconvenient places. She adjusted the stack just enough to glimpse the object, a long cream envelope addressed in bold, aggressive handwriting to Mr. Silas Thorne, room 66. The sight confirmed her earlier suspicion. This must be the letter Thomas had hidden. She made no move to retrieve it. Instead, she straightened slowly and smiled at Betty. You young people must be very careful these days, she said softly. Little things forgotten in a moment of panic can look very confusing afterwards to those who are inclined to confusion. Betty flushed scarlet, her hands trembling. We didn't... Thomas never... my dear, I shouldn't say anything at all without someone sensible to advise you, Miss Marple interrupted gently. People often talk themselves into quite dreadful difficulties. I have known it to happen. You might perhaps ask Colonel Melchett for a word. He is a just man. She left the girl staring after her and returned to the tea room, her mind already fitting this new piece into the emerging pattern. A hidden letter, an ungrieving widow, a room with a mysterious draught, and somewhere in the midst of it all, Miss Marple thought, there was a very patient, very calculating mind who believed they had arranged everything most cleverly. They usually did. The atmosphere in the inn thickened as evening drew in, lamps being lit one by one, casting pools of yellow light and deepening the shadows. Outside the village street lay quiet, but inside the Golden Pheasant, every murmur, every clink of china seemed amplified by the knowledge that a man had been murdered only but few hours before. Word soon reached Inspector Slack of Miss Marple's conversation with Betty, for Colonel Melchett, acting on her gentle suggestion, summoned the girl and the young Thomas to the private parlour. The door remained closed for some time, but fragments of raised voices escaped nonetheless. You withheld a letter? Came Slack's outraged tone. Do you young fools realise you could be charged with obstruction? Miss Marple continued her knitting quietly in the tea room, but her attention was firmly fixed on the parlour door. When at last it opened, Thomas emerged white-faced, but oddly relieved, as if confession had lightened some intolerable burden. Colonel Melchett followed, holding a folded sheet of paper delicately between thumb and forefinger. He crossed directly to Miss Marple. "I thought you might be interested, Miss Marple. Thomas saw this on Thorne's desk this morning. It's a draft of a letter to a London firm of solicitors. Apparently Thorne was planning to foreclose on Ashworth's loan within the week." Miss Marple took in this information without surprise. "So Mr. Ashworth stood to lose everything very soon indeed," she said mildly. "That does place him in a rather distressing position. Financial anxiety can be most disturbing to the moral sense. I recall a poulterer in Much Benham who—" Inspector Slack interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "Ashworth had opportunities, certainly, but so did half the people here. And I still say servants with grudges are more likely to resort to crude methods like poison than businessmen. Besides, we have no proof Ashworth even went near the tea tray. On the contrary," Miss Marple said to Woodman, "we have proof that several people could have gone near it. Thomas left the tray unattended on the sideboard for 2 minutes, did he not? In my experience, 2 minutes is more than sufficient for mischief, especially if the mischief maker has rehearsed the act in their mind many times beforehand." As if on cue, Mrs. Thorne glided into the room, her dark morning dress lending her an air almost theatrical in its severity. She approached Colonel Melchett with measured step. "Colonel," she said quietly, "oh, so quickly. I wonder, have you discovered whether my husband's briefcase has been found? He was never without it. He kept all his important papers there." "I noticed it's not in our room." The Inspector Slack pounced. "You're certain he had it with him?" "Quite certain," Clara replied. "He carried it into the inn himself. It was locked, as always. He would not allow even me to touch it." Miss Marple watched the exchange keenly. A missing briefcase, a letter threatening financial ruin, a victim known for ruthless dealings. These were threads of a pattern she recognised only too well from past tragedies and apparently respectable homes. "Curious," she murmured, "how things disappear at the most inconvenient moments. Rather like Mrs. Price Ridley's silver sugar tongs, which vanished just when her maid gave notice." Inspector Slack, who knew from experience that any such reminiscence might end in a highly relevant point, grudgingly took notice. "Are you suggesting the briefcase was stolen, Miss Marple?" "Not stolen, perhaps," she said softly, "but removed. People like Miss Thorne rarely travel without dangerous knowledge in their possession, knowledge that might ruin others if revealed. Later, as the guests were finally allowed to retire to their rooms under discreet police supervision, Miss Marple found herself lingering near the stairway. She observed how Mr. Ashworth hesitated at the foot of the steps before ascending, glancing towards the corridor that led to his office. She noticed, too, how Clara Thorne walked with almost exaggerated steadiness, as though each step had been carefully rehearsed. At the end of the corridor, a faint movement caught Miss Marple's eye. The curtain outside room 66 stirred again, though no window was open and no door had been recently closed. A draught where none should be, she thought, her eyes narrowing slightly. That is often where one finds the heart of the matter, some small inconsistency in the ordinary arrangements of life. And with that she retired to her own modest room, her mind already sorting and sifting the day's impressions as neatly as her folded knitting in its bag. Inspector Slack's expression, which had hovered uncertainly between satisfaction and irritation throughout the afternoon, now settled into a scowl. The notion of an empty adjoining room with its bolt withdrawn introduced a level of premeditation he found distinctly inconvenient. "Frenchman or no Frenchman," he growled, "the poison was in the tea, and the tea came from this kitchen. I'll have the facts, not fairy stories about mysterious draughts and vanishing guests." Miss Marple did not seem offended by the disparagement of her observations. She merely folded her knitting neatly in her lap and regarded the inspector with gentle interest. "I have always found," she remarked softly, "that when something appears inexplicable, locked rooms, vanishing people, it is usually because we have accepted one small false assumption without question. The trick, you see, is to discover which assumption that is." Her eyes drifted thoughtfully toward the register again. The precise slanting hand that had entered M.L. Giraud, Paris, seemed oddly familiar in its angular firmness. "It looks rather like a man's hand," observed Mrs. Bantry, peering over the Miss Marple's shoulder. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed absently, though her mind was not on gender. It was on habit, a hand accustomed to signing its name often in business matters, not unlike Mr. Thorne's, though obviously not the same, Mr. Abel. curse. Ashworth, who had been hovering anxiously near the bar, cleared his throat. The booking for room 665 came through the post, Inspector. Prepaid bank draft enclosed. He reached for a small ledger from beneath the counter. Here, the envelope, no sender's name, just a London postmark. Inspector Slack snatched up the envelope with an air of triumph. We'll let the Yards sort that one out. But I'm more interested in who had access to this so-called Frenchman's room. Staff, for a start. Ashworth, you keep a master key? Yes, of course. I did open room 665 myself yesterday afternoon to ensure everything was in order. He swallowed hard. It was never used after that. Mrs. Dalrymple sent up fresh water. Betty placed the towels. No one reported seeing the guest. Betty's lip trembled. The room looked the same each time, sir. Bed made, nothing out of place. I thought perhaps the gentleman was dining elsewhere. Or, Miss Marple suggested mildly, that there was no gentleman at all. A prepaid booking, unused bed, an obliging connecting door, and a very strong motive for someone to appear to be downstairs while actually being upstairs. Her comment drew several sharp glances. Clara Thorne's eyes flickered just once toward Mr. Ashworth, a quick betraying movement that did not escape Miss Marple. At that moment Dr. Haydock approached, with an air of professional reluctance. There is another matter, Slack. I noticed an old scar on Thorne's left wrist. Self-inflicted, beyond question and quite recent. The sort one sometimes sees after a failed attempt at, taking one's own life. Inspector Slack frowned. What are you suggesting, Doctor? That he poisoned himself? Not with a concentration like that. Besides, why fuss with the tea trays and locked doors if he wanted to do himself in? I'm suggesting nothing, Dr. Haydock replied crisply. I merely state facts. Whatever was troubling Thorne, it was serious enough to drive him to extremes even before today. Miss Marple's fingers resumed their gentle motion over the thin soft blue wool. An attempted suicide, blackmail, a will in flux, fraudulent loans, a mysteriously unused room. Each element suggested a man in the process of rearranging his affairs, and others who had begun to rearrange theirs in response. What puzzles me, she said to Mrs. Bantry in a tone of idle musing, is that everyone seems so certain the poison entered the tea upstairs, yet no one has considered whether a thoroughly frightened man expecting enemies might have altered his usual habits only today. Mrs. Bantry stared. You mean? Miss Marple's eyes crinkled. I mean nothing at all, yet, but I should like very much to know who persuaded Thorne to take his tea alone this afternoon when by all accounts he rarely did such a thing. Evening settled over the Golden Pheasant with an oppressive weight, as though the low beams themselves had absorbed the tension and were now pressing it back down upon the assembled company. Lamps were lit, curtains were drawn, the smell of strong tea and hastily prepared supper drifted from the kitchen, though very little was eaten. Murder is notoriously bad for the appetite. Inspector Slack, having conferred at length with Colonel Melchett and Dr. Haydock, seemed at last to reach one of his characteristic conclusions. He strode into the parlour where Clara Thorne sat by the fire, her black-clad figure a pool of darkness against the rose-patterned chintz. Mrs. Thorne, he began, with the air of a man pronouncing sentence, you had the strongest motive. Your husband was about to disinherit you in favour of this Marsh fellow. You spent years in Paris, you could manage a French accent well enough to fool a telegraph clerk, and you had opportunity to book the adjoining room in a false name. You've shown no natural grief, and you insisted he take tea alone? I'm obliged to tell you that you're under suspicion. A ripple went through the room, Miss Pinkerton gave a little cry, and Mrs. Bantry's hand flew to her pearls. Clara, however, only straightened slightly in her chair. If you wish to arrest me, Inspector, she said quietly, you'd better do so now, Adam Penmay. But I will tell you this. If Silas had lived another month, I should have left him. I did not need his money half, but not so much as I needed my freedom. Miss Marple, knitting in the corner, looked up with mild interest. That is very curious, my dear. One hears that declaration so often after a husband's death, but very rarely beforehand. Yet you speak as though you had already made your plans. Clara's composure wavered for the first time. I had, she admitted. I have a small income of my own, my father's. Silas never knew. I only learned of his intention to change the will this morning, when he foolishly left his memorandum on the dressing table. I was angry, certainly, but not surprised. Blackmailers rarely change their nature. They simply alter their victims. At the word blackmailers, several people shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple's eyes under their faded lashes made a neat circuit of the room. 3 faces in particular held her attention. Mr. Ashworth, whose fingers drummed a nervous tattoo on the arm of his chair. Miss Pinkerton, pale and strained. And Thomas, the young waiter, sitched the thing by you through her to the door, with the hollow-eyed look of one who has seen more of life than his years warrant. Before Inspector Slack could formulate a suitably sceptical reply, a sudden commotion erupted from the passage leading to the kitchen. A clatter, a cry, the shattering of crockery. Colonel Melchett rose at once, and Miss Marple, with surprising agility for her age, was not far behind. They found Thomas sprawled on the tiled kitchen floor, his cocoa mug overturned beside him, dark liquid pooling among the broken shards. Mrs. Duff? Dalrymple was wringing her hands, her normally ruddy face a ghastly white. He just took a sip, sir, she gasped to her. Colonel Melchett said he felt queer, then down he went like a stooge. Oh, not again! Not poison in my kitchen again! Haydock pushed through and knelt beside the boy, examining his pupils, checking his pulse. Not dead, he pronounced after a tense moment, but always had a nasty dose of something. This smells faintly of the same preparation, diluted. Someone meant to silence him, not necessarily kill him outright. Inspector Slack looked thunderstruck. But Mrs. Thorne has been here in the parlour the whole time, he protested. She couldn't have got too near his cocoa. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle, almost apologetic. Which would suggest, would it not, Inspector, that we have been directing our suspicions a little too narrowly? Someone is growing impatient. Twice in one day is a great deal of poison for such a small village. Her gaze rested, for the briefest instant, on Mr. Ashworth's trembling hands, and then moved serenely on, as though she had noticed nothing at all. The room seemed to lean collectively toward Clara Thorne, as if pulled by the gravity of the revelation. Inspector Slack advanced upon her with a kind of bullish eagerness, already smelling the conclusion of his case. Scar on the left wrist, false whiskers, French, booking, connected room, husband about to disinherit her. Do you deny any of that, madam? Clara lifted her chin with an effort that looked almost painful. I do not deny the scar, she said quietly. I burned myself years ago on a Paris stove, and I do not deny that my husband meant to leave me in near poverty. But I had no need to kill him, Inspector, not when I already had what I wanted. That unexpected statement caused several people to start. Geoffrey Sasha stepped forward quickly. Clara, no! She silenced him with a swift, imperious glance. Silas had already signed a deed of transfer last week, Inspector. I am the legal owner of our London flat and all its contents, regardless of his new will. And as for his business, she inclined her head almost imperceptibly toward Marsh. My husband had become inconvenient for more than one person here. It was a bold thing to say, and Miss Marple watched her with increased interest. Clara was not behaving like a cornered criminal. She was behaving like a woman who had grown tired of fear. Inspector Slack snorted. Fine speeches won't alter the facts. You had motive, opportunity, and the theatrical training enough from your Paris days. My Paris days, Clara interrupted with icy precision, consisted of caring for an invalid aunt and attending church bazaars. If I ever saw a theatre, it was from the outside. Before Slack could retort, another minor drama diverted attention. Young Thomas hurried in from the back entrance, his face white as paper. Inspector, sir, the back door's been forced, he swallowed. And Mr. Marsh is missing from his room. His suitcase is still there, but his coat and hat are gone. Geoffrey March, who had been standing 3 feet away only moments before, was indeed no longer in the tea room. Chairs scraped, voices rose, and Inspector Slack swore under his breath. Right, he barked. No one else moves. Sergeant, get 2 men and search the grounds. Check the lane, or the churchyard, the river path of Godamsa. Miss Marple's eyes had sharpened. Marsh's disappearance at such a moment was not the action of an innocent man merely upset by the proceedings. Nor, she thought, was it quite the behaviour of a guilty one who had just been conveniently handed an excuse to flee. It felt orchestrated. The search party had been gone no more than 10 minutes when a shout came from the direction of the old mill stream. The cry carried a peculiar mixture of alarm and something like relief. They found Geoffrey Marsh lying on the damp grass near the water's edge, his overcoat half off, his head bloodied, a A heavy-setting stone lay nearby, darkened with what looked suspiciously like the same. He stirred feebly as Dr. Haydock knelt beside him. "Not dead," the doctor pronounced after a brisk examination. "A glancing blow, enough to stun, not to kill. Whoever did this wasn't trying very hard." Inspector Slack pounced on the obvious conclusion. "Clara Thorne, trying to silence him," Percy exclaimed. She realised he knew too much. But Miss Marple, who had arrived just behind the others, was looking not at Marsh, nor at the stone, but at the trampled grass and the marks near the water. Two sets of footprints, one deeper and urgent, the other oddly hesitant, almost staged. And there, half hidden by the reed bed, a second stone of similar size, quite dry, untouched by blood. "How very curious," she murmured. "Two stones when one would have sufficed. And such a remarkably gentle blow for a poesist. His idad plows for so determined a tremendam basanmester. Cragapajut carpeteme misbudstatum disubsuitemtis destastumkin. Her gaze lifted to the cluster of faces under the grey evening sky. Clara pale but composed, Ashworth sweating and twitching, Miss Pinkerton wringing her hands, Thomas and Betty clinging to one another, Mrs. Dalrymple with lips compressed in disapproval, and standing slightly apart the village constable who had first discovered Marsh by the stream, breathing a little too hard for such a short run. Someone, Miss Marple reflected, was working very hard indeed to push suspicion in one carefully chosen direction, and in doing so had just told her rather more than they intended. Mr. Ashworth swallowed convulsively, his collar seeming suddenly too tight. I check all the rooms in the afternoon," he stammered. "Standard procedure. I was in and out of several, couldn't say exactly when." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple observed gently, "that your memory should fail you at such a crucial point. Yet young Thomas, I think, remembers your movements rather well." The boy started, colour draining from his face. I don't know, Miss Marple." "But you do know, Thomas," she continued kindly. "You told Betty and Betty, in her anxiety, confided it to Colonel Melchett, who was wise enough to say nothing until the right moment. But you saw Mr. Ashworth go upstairs at 3:30 with a small tray, did you not? And that tray contained a teapot and a single cup." Inspector Slack rounded on the innkeeper. "Well, Ashworth, what have you to say to that?" Ashworth's hands gripped the back of a chair so tightly the knuckles shone white. It was just hot water," he said desperately. "Mr. Thorne rang for it. Said he wanted to make his own tea from some special leaves he carried with him. I took it up myself to show personal affection. Doctor kid." Haydock's voice cut in quietly. "You failed to mention this earlier. Why?" Ashworth licked his lips. I forgot, Doctor. Everything's been such a shock." "People rarely forget the last time they saw a man alive just before he's murdered," Miss Marple remarked mildly. "Particularly when that man holds their entire financial future in his hands." A brittle silence followed. Clara Thorne sat very still, her eyes fixed not on Ashworth but on Geoffrey Marsh. There was something intent, almost measuring in her gaze. "Miss Marple," Colonel Melchett said slowly, "you spoke of misdirection, of the disguise, the false French guest. Are you suggesting Ashworth arranged all that theatrical nonsense to cover his own much simpler method?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that someone appreciated how very convenient it would be if a suspicion fell upon a wrong person, preferably a woman with a scar who had indeed purchased a disguise. Yet no one has thought to ask how Mrs. Thorne knew of that scar being described to the costumier's clerk when the inspector only mentioned it here, in this room, not half an hour ago." All eyes swung back to Clara. She did not flinch. "I knew," she said quietly, "because Geoffrey wrote to me from London before he came down. He'd made inquiries at the costumier's himself this morning, after receiving a most extraordinary anonymous note hinting that I had purchased a disguise to kill my husband." Geoffrey Marsh stared at her, appalled. "Clara, you weren't supposed—" "I wasn't supposed to mention that, was I?" she finished calmly. "Just as I wasn't supposed to mention the letter you received from Silas last week, informing you he intended to cut you out of the firm entirely and to report your creative accounting to the authorities." A low murmur passed through the company. Inspector Slack swung from Ashworth to Marsh like a man whose compass had suddenly spun wild. "See here," Marsh protested, attempting a thin smile. "This is preposterous. I travelled down from London this afternoon. Half a dozen people on the train can attest to it. I only arrived after poor Silas was already dead." "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "Which is why you needed someone else's hands to pour the poison. Someone harried, desperate, terrified of losing his inn and reputation. Someone you could control with a few quiet words in an office, and then abandoned the gallows as soon as the noose tightened." Ashworth made a strangled sound. He said, he burst out suddenly, so standing on his forehead. He said if I didn't help, he'd tell Thorne to call it the loan immediately, that I'd lose everything within a week. He gave me the bottle, told me how much to use, said it would be quick. Miss Marple looked at him with grave compassion. "And did he also perhaps suggest that if you arranged the booking of room 665 under a false French name, he would see that your debt was quietly reduced, or at least delayed?" Ashworth's shoulders sagged. "He arranged the telegram," he whispered. "Told me exactly what to send." For a moment the room seemed to vibrate with held breath. The crackle of the fire, the faint ticking of the inn's clock, even the whisper of the autumn wind outside. All these small sounds grew sharper against the charged silence that followed Miss Marple's quiet summation. Geoffrey Marsh ceased struggling. Some private calculation appeared to flicker behind his eyes. Then his shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. When he spoke, his voice was low and bitter rather than defiant. "Silas thought himself very clever," he said. "He bled everyone he touched, your schoolmistress, your innkeeper, half a dozen others besides. Blackmail here, ruinous loans there. Oh, he was careful, all done such a way that no court could touch him, but never careful enough to imagine that someone might turn his methods against him." Inspector Slack pounced. "So you admit entering room 66 before the tea was brought up? You admit booking room 65 under a false name, purchasing that disguise, obtaining strychnine?" "I admit," Marsh cut in sharply, "that I came here last night and took room 665. That I entered his room this afternoon while he napped. I poured the strychnine into the watercraft on his bedside table, much more subtle than the tea, I thought. But he woke as I was leaving. He recognised me even in the costume. He said he would go to the police, yet that he had evidence about certain accounts. So I—" His mouth twisted. "We struggled. He was grabbed at the carafe himself. The glass caught my hand. He drank. I watched." Clara Thorne closed her eyes briefly, but still no tears came. Only a long, measured exhalation, as if a burden she had carried for years was finally being set down. "But that left you with a problem," Miss Marple said, her tone almost conversational. "A dead man in a locked room, no witnesses to his drinking the water. Far too suggestive of deliberate murder on your part." Marsh gave a short, mirthless laugh. "So I improved upon the scene. I bolted the connecting door behind me, returned to my room, donned my ordinary clothes, and left the inn by the service stair. An hour later I came back by the front in full view of the staff to take tea in my room, only it went instead to Silas. The boy here," he nodded at Thomas, "became my unwitting accomplice. When they found the body, it would appear the tea had done it, and who better for suspicion than a man pressed to the wall by Silas's loan?" Inspector Slack looked simultaneously triumphant and uncomfortable. "You realise, Marsh, this is as good as a confession." Marsh's eyes went to Miss Marple. "I might have escaped, you know, if not for your village nursery methods." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Human nature is really much the same everywhere, Mr. Marsh. One has only to recognise the pattern. Excessive poison, theatrical flourishes, convenient evidence, all symptoms of a mind that prefers drama to simplicity. A truly cold-blooded murderer would have let Mr. Ashworth hang without ornament." Colonel Melchett signalled to the constables, who moved in with professional briskness. The click of handcuffs on Marsh's wrist sounded oddly loud in the old inn. He did not resist as they led him away, though he paused once beside Clara. "You'll get your money now," he said harshly. "The will stands as it is. Widow's portion, more generous than you deserve." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "I never wanted his money," she replied quietly, "only to be free of him." When they had gone and the formalities began to wind down, the atmosphere in the Golden Pheasant shifted almost imperceptibly. Voices resumed in low, shaken tones. Chairs were pushed back. Teacups refilled with hands still faintly trembling. Life, like an overstrained clock, began once more to tick. Later that evening, as the inn emptied and the villagers drifted home to share their versions of events, Miss Marple sat by the fire with Dr. Haydock and Mrs. Bantry. Her knitting lay for finished on her lap, the soft blue scarf neatly folded. "It will be a 9 days wonder," Mrs. Bantry observed, "and then everyone will be back to arguing about the church roof and Mrs. Price Ridley's chrysanthemums." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and yet underneath something will have shifted. People cannot quite look at a neighbour in the same way after discovering how near true wickedness has come." "And up it." Haydock studied her thoughtfully. "You saw it very early, didn't you? That the obvious suspects were too obvious." "Not saw exactly," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But it reminded me of old Mrs. Pike, who ran the sweet shop in my youth. She always made the biggest display of the stale toffees, piled up in the window in gaudy tins. The freshest goods she kept in plain jars on the back shelf for customers who truly knew what they wanted. When everyone pointed to the poisoned tea, I knew at once that was the window display, not the real stock." She rose with a little sigh, gathering her things. People are very much like sweet shop proprietors, they arrange their lives for effect. But underneath, the same old temptations remain: greed, fear, vanity, and sometimes, I'm afraid, murder. One only has to look past the display. Outside, the wind rattled the sign of the Golden Pheasant against its iron bracket. St. Mary Mead lay quiet under the autumn sky, its thatched roofs and neat hedges once more serene in appearance, if not entirely in truth. Room 606 at the top of the inn stood empty, its door firmly locked, the number plate gleaming faintly in the gaslight. Mr. and Miss Marple, walking home along the familiar lane, drew her shawl more closely about her shoulders. The village, she reflected, would recover as it always did. Gossip would soften the sharper edges of the story. Pity would temper judgment. Life would return to its customary small preoccupations. But she, for her part, would remember Silas Thorne and Geoffrey Marsh as yet another reminder that wickedness, like mildew, thrives best in dark corners, and that a little sunlight, however gently applied, could do a world of good. The following Sunday, St. Mary Mead returned, at least outwardly, to its customary air of pious tranquillity. The church flowers had been arranged with particular care. Michaelmas daisies and late roses in muted shades, and the fair of the congregation settled into their usual pews with the air of people who meant to think of higher things while being quite unable to resist low-aired ones. Miss Marple occupied her accustomed seat near the front, her hymn book open, and her mat, trimmed with a modest spray of faded violets, set at its precise unfussy angle. To a casual observer she appeared serenely absorbed in the service. Only someone who knew her well would have recognised the faint, thoughtful tightening at the corners of her eyes that indicated an active mind at work. During the final hymn she became gently aware of movement beside her. Clara Thorne had slipped into the pew with quiet care, having arrived intentionally late to avoid the more direct stares of the villagers. When the service ended and the congregation spilled out into the bright chilly sunshine, Miss Marple found herself naturally at Clara's side. The widow's black garments were severe but well chosen. Grief, Miss Marple reflected, had seldom been so handsomely attired. Yet Clara's face, now free of the rigid self-control that had sustained her at the Golden Pheasant, showed an undeniable weariness. "I wish to thank you," Clara said after a brief awkward silence as they walked slowly along the gravel path. "Not only for revealing the truth about Mr. Marsh, but for seeing that I was not what some might have liked to believe." "My dear," Miss Marple replied gently, "you were not obliged to stay and endure suspicion. Many women would have left at the first opportunity." Clara's lips curved in a faint humorless smile. "Many women have somewhere to go. I had only a husband who treated me as inconvenient property and a marriage contract that trapped me very neatly. Freedom is a strange sensation." Mrs. Snailfer understood that more than she chose to say. Freedom after long constraint, whether emotional or practical, was never simple. It often brought with it a disquieting question. What now? They paused by the lich gate. Ahead of them, Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Price Ridley were already in earnest conversation with Miss Pinkerton, no doubt arranging the details of how the case would be retold at every tea-table for months. "There will be gossip," Miss Marple said quietly. "A great deal of it. Some will say you must have known what Marsh intended, that you encouraged it, perhaps." Clara's eyes darkened. "I did not. I swear to you," Miss Marple nodded. "I believe you. You had sufficient motive to wish your husband gone, that is true. But you had not, if I may say so, the necessary hardness to see such a business through." nor the vanity to imagine you could arrange it without consequence. Mr. Marsh possessed both in abundance. They walked a few paces in silence. Do you suppose, Clara asked at last, that the village will ever see me as anything but half of that sordid story? In time, Miss Marple answered, the village will remember you as the lady who bore much and spoke little, who did not make a fuss, and who behaved with dignity when lesser women might have made a scene. Villages are not kind exactly, but they are eventually fair in their own fashion. Later that afternoon, over tea with Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple found herself pressed, as she had expected, for the whole story. It was all so clever, Jane, Mrs. Bantry insisted, leaning forward eagerly. The disguise, the false room, the timed telegram. You must admit, as murders go, it had a certain style. Miss Marple stirred her tea, her expression reflected. Oh yes, Dolly, it had the style. That was its greatest weakness. Real life is seldom so ornamental. Whenever one sees a crime bedecked in theatricals, one must look instead to the plain workaday facts. Who had money to lose, reputation to protect, and sufficient arrogance to believe himself cleverer than everyone else. And Marsh had all three, Mrs. Bantry agreed. But I still say you were the only one who truly saw it. Slack would have arrested poor Ashworth if you hadn't interfered. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I merely noticed what was inconsistent. An innkeeper frantic about scandal, yet strangely resigned to being suspected. A teacup that ought to have been cold and was not. And an arrival time from London that contradicted the timetable. After that, it was simply a matter of waiting for human nature to reveal itself. It always does, you know, sooner or later. Outside, the late afternoon light slanted across the roofs of St. Mary Mead, turning the tiles copper and the chimney smoke silver. Children's voices drifted faintly from the green. Inside the cosy sitting room, with its faded chintz and familiar clutter, the horror of room 666 already felt distant, half absorbed into the comfortable fabric of village life. Miss Marple reached for her knitting basket and drew out a new skein of wool, soft grey this time, as if in quiet acknowledgement that neither pure innocence nor unmixed wickedness were ever the whole of the human story. As the needles took up their steady rhythmic music, she thought, not of Marsh or the Thorn, now bound to the sturdy justice of courts and prisons, but of Clara and Ashworth and young Thomas and Betty, all left to negotiate the uneasy freedom that follows in the wake of other people's sins. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was both the cause of all such tragedies and the only possible remedy for them. It was, in its way, the greatest mystery of all. The days that followed settled into that peculiar calm which often descends after great upheaval, a stillness in which people go about their business with outward normality. Whilst beneath the surface, conversation circled back again and again to the recent storm. At the Golden Pheasant, the tower room had quietly reverted to its old village name. The brass numerals 666 were taken down one misty morning, and by luncheon the door wore a modest wooden plaque. The tower room. No one remarked upon the change directly, but Miss Marple knew every villager had noticed and silently approved. Certain experiments in modernity, she reflected, sit rather badly on old English beams. Mr. Ashworth, chastened yet oddly strengthened by his ordeal, made a point of serving in the bar himself more frequently. His manner, formerly a little self-conscious and eager to impress, had become humbler, warmer, almost grateful. He had taken to saying to regulars, "We'll keep things simple and honest from now on," in a way that suggested the phrase meant far more than just the pricing of ale. Miss Marple visited the inn one quiet afternoon, ostensibly to take tea, but in truth to observe how the place had absorbed its brush with notoriety. The staff moved with that subdued briskness common to those who have been frightened and then spared. Betty and Thomas, now openly engaged, worked side by side behind the counter, exchanging those quiet glances of people who have seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," Thomas said, flushing a little but meeting her eyes steadily. "We've got your favourite seed cake today. Mrs. Dalrymple said you'd earned it." Miss Marple smiled. How very kind of her. Seed cake, I've always thought, is an excellent restorative for both body and moral fibre. She took her usual seat by the window, the very one from which she had watched the first ripples of drama spread outward that fateful afternoon. Now the village years green to beyond lay tranquil. A small boy sailed paper boats in a puddle while his mother chatted with the vicar's wife. Life, as it liked to do, had gone on. Clara Thorne came to see her 2 days before leaving for Paris. She stood for a moment in the cottage doorway, looking somehow lighter, as if years had been lifted from her shoulders. "I wanted to thank you in person," she said, "not only for proving I hadn't killed Silas, but for seeing clearly what I hardly dared admit to myself, that I had been living not a marriage, but a long, fearful arrangement." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "My dear, many women of my generation would understand you very well. We were taught that endurance was a virtue. It is, sometimes. But there comes a point where endurance becomes mere postponement of the life one ought to live." Clara's eyes filled, but her smile was steady. "In Paris there is work waiting for me at a small gallery. And someone who kept faith. It feels almost indecent to begin again so quickly after a death, yet death," Miss Marple said gently, "does not always bring with it tragedy fresh made. Sometimes it merely removes what has long been a tragedy. You will not be forgetting, only moving forward." When Clara had gone, leaving behind a faint trace of French perfume and an envelope containing a photograph of the Paris gallery, for you to imagine me there, Miss Marple sat, for a time in quiet reflection. On the mantel lay the local paper, its account of the Golden Pheasant murder, already acquiring the faintly embellished tone of village legend. The article spoke gravely of a diabolically clever plot, and praised the swift, decisive work of the county police, ably supported by a certain well-known village lady whose modesty prevents further identification. Miss Marple permitted herself the smallest of smiles. That evening, as the sky faded into a soft mauve, and the first chill of approaching winter brushed the air, she stepped into her garden. The bulbs she had meant to plant before all the excitement were finally tucked into their beds. Neat labels marked where spring's promise lay hidden beneath the soil. She straightened slowly, feeling the comfortable protest of well-used joints, and looked over her small domain with quiet satisfaction. Human nature, she thought, was very like a garden. Left entirely untended, it might run to wildness and choke its better growth with weeds. Over-controlled, it could become stifled, unnatural, forced. The skill lay in knowing when to prune, when to stake, when simply to allow things to grow in their own way, and when to occasionally to remove something that had become dangerous. To all around it. Behind her the little cottage lamp glowed cheerfully, a beacon of domestic peace. Somewhere beyond the trees, the sign of the Golden Pheasant creaked faintly in the evening breeze. Its brief season of infamy are already softening into story. In parlours and at shop counters, people would retell the events of the death in room 66 with shivers and satisfaction, never quite realising that what had truly been on display was not the wicked cleverness of one man, but the old familiar pattern of temptation, fear, vanity, and sometimes quiet courage. Miss Marple drew her shawl a little closer and went back indoors. There was mending to be done. A letter from her nephew Raymond is to be answered, and a new piece of knitting to begin. The great dramas of life and death might pass through saints, Mary Mead from time to time, but it was in these steady tasks she felt that one truly held the world together. And so as the autumn deepened and the village lights winked on one by one, Jane Marple settled into a chair, took up her needles and, with the calm assurance of one who understood both patterns and people, began again.